I feel like democracy in the United States is absolutely under threat. And if it's under threat in the United States, it is under threat everywhere.
Across the Village Media Network, welcome back to a Closer Look with Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Democracy, that is what we're talking tonight. Democracy's second act, why politics needs the public. And it does.
Yes, this is a book you've started reading. I've read some snippets of it. I haven't got through it all yet. But it's a fascinating book and very timely.
Yes,
we're talking so much about democracy. And it's written by Peter MacLeod and Richard Johnson. And basically, it's an argument that we're not done with democracy, that we ushered in some amazing things in the first wave of democracy, as they describe it, but there's a second act to come.
Yes.
This idea that, and their central thesis is that the people need to be a much bigger part of the next phase of democracy now,
Yes.
right? Sort of citizens' assembly, so to speak. And really, this idea that government exists on a different plane than the average Joe, and that the average Joes need to get involved in politics a little more. It's a fascinating discussion, and there was an excerpt in the Walrus that I read from the book, and Peter and Richard have done a couple media interviews already. And like I said, it's just the time we live in now, where we're talking about the fact that certain democracies are under threat.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder of the great things that democracy have given us and why it's something worth fighting for. Peter's a fascinating guy and a very well-spoken person, and I think people should definitely be listening to this conversation.
We hear it often. Democracy is broken. But is it? Or is democracy just stuck? That is the central question of the new book, Democracy's Second Act, Why Politics Needs the Public, written by Peter MacLeod and Richard Johnson. They argue that the first act of democracy, anchored in voting rights and representative government, achieved extraordinary gains. But they also believe those achievements represent the promise of democracy, not its completion. So what do we need to do next? How do we usher in democracy's second act? We're pleased to be joined tonight by one of the authors of the book, Peter MacLeod. Peter, appreciate your time tonight. Good to see you.
Really great to be with you guys.
All right, Peter, let's start with the good news. As you say in the book, democracy achieved some extraordinary things. Remind us what those things are, just in case some of us have forgotten.
Well, we can take it almost for granted, sadly, but the reality is that the vast majority of people living on this planet, they don't enjoy the basic rights. They don't have access to the democratic institutions that really provide the structure for our lives here in Canada. They don't get a chance to cast a vote. They don't have a free and independent media. They don't have a independent and trusted judiciary. And they don't have the peaceful transfer of power. And they certainly don't have universal suffrage. That is the idea that all adults have a chance to cast a vote. And for a very long time, we didn't have any of those things either. They are the product of more than 400 years of painstaking struggle as we have found a way to push the people who want all the power off the throne and out of our parliaments, so that each of us has a chance to decide the way we want to be governed in a way that is more or less fair.
It's interesting because I think so many of us have forgotten that. I think we just enjoy the democracy we live in. That's part of the problem, isn't it, Peter?
Well, I mean, everybody gets used to what's around them. Mm-hmm. But let me assure you, in a country like Ukraine right now, what's at stake is very much front and center. It's very much top of mind. And, the struggle, as we've seen with our neighbors to the south of us, continues. That when we get complacent is probably when democracies become most at risk. And, going back to the time of the ancients, democracies have always been vulnerable to demagogues, people who want to promise easy answers to really bad things that might be going on. And, we can't fall prey to that kind of simplistic thinking.
So for you, Peter, ordinary people, not politicians, are the key to democracy's second act, that we need to create new institutions that tap into the talents, judgment, and capabilities of the people in our communities. Why is that so important, and how would it work?
Well, I think it's important to say that we need great politicians too, right? We need politicians who are doing the right thing for people. They're running for the right reasons. They may disagree, but they're trying to make life and society better. But, one of the things that hasn't changed virtually since we all got the vote was the number of people who actually ever get to go to Ottawa or sit on a committee or make a decision in their local community. The number of people who are actively engaged in our political life hasn't increased all that much. And frankly, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like the two of you and most of your listeners and readers are probably capable of doing more than just voting every 4 years. And part of the reason we feel frustrated is because that's basically the only choice we get in our society. And, we talk about ways in this book that in Canada and in other countries, you can see the green shoots of our next democratic evolution, ways in which people are helping to participate in the governance of their societies and make things better in their local communities.
And the term we often hear in the book is citizens' assemblies. This idea that we can get these people together, random selection, representative samples. How do we do this, Peter?
Yeah, well, this happens to be a made in Canada democratic innovation. But it goes back to a democratic ideal that precedes the vote. We are all familiar with the idea of a jury of one's peers, right? We accept the idea that randomly selected people get brought into a courtroom where you have fancy lawyers and other kinds of experts, and they're all talking about the case. So in BC about 25 years ago, they said, wouldn't it be interesting if we got a really large jury of people randomly selected to look at that province's voting system? And, at a time when we often talk down the public as really apathetic, self-interested, doesn't care about politics, they sent out 100,000 letters and 10,000 people volunteered to serve on this thing and spend, almost a dozen weekends doing so. Other countries became inspired by Canada's example. Ireland, which is obviously a very Catholic country, they struggled with the question of same-sex marriage. Their parliament was just at loggerheads around it. So they sent out letters to randomly selected Irish people, invited them into a citizens' assembly, and they changed their country's constitution. There have now been more than 1,000 of these assemblies taking place in countries around the world, doing the stuff for which, there are often lots of values engaged. It's complex topics, but they trust people to work their way through the trade-offs and those values and actually give really durable, thoughtful advice. So citizens' assemblies bring the idea of a jury into our political process, not to decide, but to give parliamentarians a consensus opinion.
It's fascinating because when I hear the term, at least I do, I assume, well, no one would want to participate in that. People have their own things going on. They're not going on. But the example you gave is true. A lot of people do want to come forward. And we've been having some of these kind of conversations with our readers in some of our communities. And it's been amazing when we reach out to ask them if they want to participate. Yeah. Why do people assume what I assume, Peter, that people wouldn't want to be a part of this?
Well, look, I think people are smart. I think they know the value of their time and they've got good noses. And sadly, too often when government reaches out and asks for them to come to a town hall meeting, they know the decisions have already been made. They know the questions they're about to be asked aren't really real and the whole thing feels a bit cooked. However, we found that if you give people the chance to do something real, to make a difference, and not to get off easy, not to just have to put your hands up at the end and, winner takes all, but to actually work through the issues so that everybody leaves feeling more or less okay. People are like, okay, I like to solve problems. I care about my community. And, one of the reasons why we have the Primary Care Act in Ontario and $2 billion more going into making sure people have a family doc is because a bunch of Ontarians put up their hands when they were invited to have a conversation about what our primary care system should look like. And credit to the government, they listened.
Peter, we recently ran a trust poll with over 22,000 responses. I want to make sure I get these numbers right. 63% said you need to be very careful dealing with people these days, and trust in government is even lower, yet countries that score highest on well-being tend to have high trust in institutions and in each other. How do citizens' assemblies actually help rebuild trust, not in theory, but in practice?
Well, I want to just pause on the statistic there for a moment, because I think it exemplifies part of the challenge here. We spend a lot of time asking whether citizens trust government.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen a survey that asks government whether they trust citizens?
It's a great question.
That's a
I'm
good
sure
point.
they do. I'm sure they do them. They just don't tell us about them.
Right? Because I think a lot of people feel like, government's just going to make the decisions, and whether they vote for red, blue, or orange or green, like, not enough changes in their lives. And I think, I have some sympathy for that position, but I also think people find themselves at such a distance from those decisions, it's hard to understand the decisions that government are making. So bringing them into the room in some way, giving them the chance to hear from the experts who have different views of the issue, giving them the chance to hear from one another, and again, work their way towards common ground. Yeah, we're also concerned about polarization. We need to be, because it can go someplace very ugly. But a lot of this preoccupation with polarization, I think, is a bit of a mirage. Because if you get people together and you give them a task and similar information and a chance to change their mind and explore different views, they generally can find their way again to common ground. And then when government acts on that, people trust it. They like it. They feel like government's listening.
Just to be the devil's advocate, I guess my concern, and sometimes we deal with this too as editors, right? I've been in journalism, I feel like, for 100 years. And sometimes a reader will, a member of the public or a reader will reach out with a totally insane suggestion that doesn't make any sense because they don't know how the system works or how this issue works. And I think that's maybe some of the issues with, I'm sure, some senior bureaucrats who know their file inside and out. They don't want to hear from 20 people who have no idea what the issue is about. How do you bridge that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to, we've spent a lot of time in the last 60 or 70 years since the advent of public opinion research, worried about what people like and dislike. We've spent very little energy on what they know and don't know. And I'd like to see some polling figures about, some of the basics in our society. Periodically, we ask Canadians, could you pass our own citizenship test? And they say, no. Well, okay, let's not worry too much about that. It'd be nice if they knew a little bit more about our history. But do they know how our criminal justice system works? Do they know how the tax system really works? Do they know how bills become law, or how they could, reach out to city council if they were concerned about an issue in their community? There's a whole idea that a great American thinker named John Dewey gave us. He said, don't worry so much about civic literacy. He said, worry about democratic fitness. Make sure that people have a sense of moral courage. Make sure that people have a sense of voice and agency. And the only way you build up any kind of muscle, of course, is through practice. So we need to give people a chance to practice acting on their beliefs, learning and working with others. And, the difficulty with social media right now, as you certainly understand in the press, is that it warps our idea of the public, because often those with the sharpest opinions find themselves amplified by algorithms designed to torque up people's indignation. And lo and behold, it seems like suddenly everybody has a crazy uncle.
Peter, let's talk about the practical side. What's the right funding model for Citizens Assembly? Should governments be earmarking funds for them, and at what level do they make the most sense? Local, provincial, national, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think all of the above. Now, this doesn't mean that they're the right mechanism to just have a good think on a Saturday afternoon about what people might like in their community. But hey, we've got lots of really challenging questions locally about infrastructure investment, provincially about health and education, nationally about climate or taxation or support for seniors, or controversially, look at our recent a physician-assisted dying legislation made, which is a very complex, values-laden question. In France, they ran a national citizens assembly to work out a kind of social consensus on that question. We could have done the same as well. But yes, I think government should be paying for it. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year running our national parliament. The same for our provincial legislatures, tens of millions of dollars running local councils. Why wouldn't we spend a fraction of that to get vastly more Canadians into the work of co-governing, right? Not just electing people to do the hard work and governing for us, but to see that everybody once in their life doesn't even have an opportunity to take a seat at the table, but at least knows someone who has.
It's a big shift, right? If it would be a big shift and even for a political leader to come out and say, this is what I want to implement, right? We want to change this. I'm sure it'd be a little risky to be the person that comes out first and says they want to do this. What have you heard from politicians who've heard your arguments, who've read your book?
Well, Belgium is a really interesting country in this respect because they've run a number of citizen panels and assemblies. They have an area in Belgium. It's kind of like a regional parliament, and they have elected members. And every time there's an election, they also then randomly select a citizens assembly. And that citizens assembly decides the 3 or 4 long-term issues that they'd like to examine, a bit like we've used royal commissions. Mm-hmm. And so you've got electeds and selecteds. And so you ask some of the Belgian politicians, how do you feel about having these, ordinary people sitting next to you and thinking about these issues? You know what they say? They say, we always behave better when we have guests in the house. Right?
Yes.
So let me take the two of you and some of your readers and stick them on a parliamentary committee in Ottawa. And I think they're probably going to ask smart questions, and I think they might change the mood in that room too.
That's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that. So is that the national government that does that or a regional government in Belgium that does that?
It's a regional government similar to our provinces.
Yeah, that's fascinating though. I'd love to read that. Obviously that's in your book somewhere. I haven't read the whole book yet, but it's in there.
That's all right.
I want to hear more about it. Yeah, that's fascinating because you do, it's that ability to, because, in the system we have now, politicians will put out a press release about some political, governments will put out press releases. They might hold a press conference. Some journalists may be able to ask a question or they might not. And that's kind of the extent of it. I mean, they don't really get a lot of face-to-face time with the average person. And then even when the average person emails a government ministry, they don't even get a response. That's part of the problem too, right?
That's definitely part of the problem. And this is a phenomenon that's not unique to Canada. I think it's been at work over the last 50 or 60 years across the West. We came out of the Second World War where we fully mobilized our populations in order to push back against, totalitarian regimes. And we won. And we did it because we recognized that everybody had a role to play. Mm-hmm. That's what the mobilization was about. And it actually created an era where income inequality was less acute than it is today. People found themselves probably more connected to one another than they are now. At that time, we saw the public as a resource, an indispensable resource to do the work of managing a society and defending a society. I think today we don't look at the public as a resource. We look at them as a risk that we need to manage, right? By communicating them in a certain way or pandering to them with, particular policy. And, the work of democratic government is really about building democratic publics that are informed, that are engaged, that can be productive. Government isn't something that happens over here in the committee room. It's something that actually happens every single day in how we interact with one another in our lives.
But you've nailed it on the head for me. You said it way better than I ever could. It does feel like government happens over there. That's really the problem at all levels of government, I feel.
And then, you when they do reach out to you, they say, well, would you give me a $5?
Yeah.
Or would you go knock on a door? And again, I think people are more capable of this. Canadians demonstrated this beautifully just 10 years ago during the Syrian refugee crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We were also moved when we saw that horrible photo of the young boy, Alan Kurdi, on the shores of Turkey. And Canada, to its credit, had already said we're going to bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees. And bless them, Lifeline Syria said, no, we can do more. And Canada has had this Group of Five program for more than a century for the private sponsorship of refugees. And the government really activated it. And you know what? Canadians, like, we are good-natured joiners, right? Like, we want to stick our red mitts up in the air and say, how can I help? How can I help my neighbor? How do I make a difference? More than 100,000 Canadians all stuck up their hands. They volunteered. They adopted a family. They raised $30,000. They took care of folks who came from a part of the world they probably knew nothing about, speaking a different language. And these families, they got those new Canadians jobs, education, housing, and they did it without much help from the government. But we now know a decade later that their health, social, economic outcomes are as good or better than those who came through our fantastic settlement agencies.
Yeah.
So that shows us what the public is capable of. Why wouldn't every government, once in its mandate, surely have something that could mobilize 100,000 Canadians around? Right? Because it pays a democratic dividend. I'll stop on this point.
No, continue.
You know, it's like the members, the Canadians who supported those Syrians, they feel better about themselves. They feel more connected to their community. You talk to them, they say, like, it was good for us too. So we want more interactions that pay a democratic dividend. That's the stuff that raises trust and connection and belonging, and that combats the loneliness that a lot of people in our society feel.
I swear to you, when I read that section of the book, you're talking about how people will come together in a moment of crisis more quickly than maybe the government can. I thought of that because that was a great example, the Syrian refugee crisis. People all over the country just came together as groups to sponsor refugees, the people they didn't even know. And it does speak, it gives you hope about the kind of thing you're talking about, that the public is ready to jump up and put their hand up and act if the right moment comes across.
Yes.
They're not as apathetic as we think they are, right, Peter?
Not a bit. And look, the nature of volunteerism has changed, right? It's not that everybody necessarily wants to go to the Rotary Club every Wednesday afternoon for the luncheon and do that for the next 30 or 40 years, right? But what we have seen with these civic challenges is that people are prepared to engage intensively and episodically. So a lot of energy for a short period of time that has a real impact. And when you look around our society, you see problems that we define as problems of scarcity, right? That, you know, there are not enough educators for the kids who need a little bit of extra help. There aren't enough folks to you know, engage with some of our older members in society. And yet, all around us, we see people with talents and capabilities that just aren't being tapped. And in some of the more successful societies, you know, yes, they need strong public services, but, you know, mutual aid is a thing, right? And connecting communities is a thing, and they've got better infrastructure to do that.
Peter, if we were to look back in, say, 20 years and say democracy's second act actually happened, what would we see that tell us it worked?
I think we would see government as a whole looking at the public very differently. It would see it, as I've said, as a resource, and it would be developing programs right across the wide suite of social needs, from involving people in the work of government to, sadly, right now, thinking about civil defense and mobilizing and organizing the community in case of disasters and you know, other, I'm afraid, challenges that might confront us. Political parties would be very different. They wouldn't think about us as donors. They would think that actually involving us in their work is good for them and good for us. And we would pay a lot more attention, as I mentioned, to not just what people like and dislike, but what they know and don't know. And in an era of misinformation, I think that's pretty vital.
I can't leave this interview without asking you about President Trump, because when people think of democracy and democracies that are under threat right now, people think of America. You're following closely what's happening there, and people saying that they feel like the end of democracy is near in the United States. Do you feel the same way?
I feel like democracy in the United States is absolutely under threat. And if it's under threat in the United States, it is under threat everywhere. And we have seen how the U.S. Treasury and its State Department, are actively funding MAGA-like entities in liberal democracies around the world. That is not the America that, Canadians know. It's not the America of the post-war era. Am I hopeful that America is going to see through the Trump era and return to the kind of liberal democratic commitments that we have known it for? I do. But it's going to require incredible energy and incredible vigilance, and it's going to require the Democratic Party and Republicans of a different breed to think about and work with their publics in better ways.
Peter, before we let you go tonight, anything that we didn't cover that we should have?
Only that I hope people will buy a copy of the book. It's democracysecondAct.org, and Richard, my co-author, and I, we're going to be traveling around the country. We love to talk to people. We love to talk to communities. We hope it's inspiring in what can feel like dark days.
All right, good stuff. There it is. Democracy's Second Act: Why Politics Needs the Public, co-authored by Peter MacLeod. Peter, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
It's been a treat. Thank you.
I love the analogy that you use, that politics is over here, and yet I don't feel like I get an invitation over there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
For sure. And I think that's part of the problem and part of the frustrations a lot of people feel with how government works, whether it's their municipal government, their provincial government, the federal government. It does feel over there. They get, tax bills in the mail, and that's the extent of it. The word democracy has been – I've never heard it discussed so much than I have in the last couple of years, right? And it feels like it's under threat, it's under attack. We're concerned about, certain democracies falling apart. And I loved the fact that he even appreciated the first question just about, let's remind ourselves what great things we have
for sure
in our democracy. And I think it's important for us all to remember that and why it's so important. And just to bring up the point as well that under David Turkstra here at Village Media, he's been quarterbacking these community conversations in some of our communities, and I believe the plan is to do them everywhere. And we're basically doing the same thing that Peter talks about in his book, just inviting people to come together. You hosted one of them in Sault Ste. Marie. Well, just tell us a little bit about how it worked.
It was a phenomenal experience. We gave people the opportunity to put their hand up and say that they wanted to participate and be asked. And I think sometimes that's all you need to do. Just ask. Do you want to help? Do you want to have a voice? We had a wonderful group, and we were tackling an important issue here in the Soo, as it is in many other communities, in the opioid crisis. A wonderful discussion. We spent the morning putting together a bit of a plan that was then going to be presented at the municipal level to City Council. Just a wonderful experience, and nothing but positive feedback from those that participated.
And the feedback that I've read from people who've been in the other ones and other communities in the Soo as well is just how they appreciated being asked to be part of that. And I believe for the one in Sudbury, there was I think more than 100 people that volunteered to come forward. And they couldn't bring everybody, so they had to parse it down to who
over 2 days.
Over 2 days, right? So I think it's a fascinating conversation. I've read snippets of the book. I haven't got through the whole thing, but it is a really interesting read at a very big moment in time.
Yeah, you don't want to simplify it, but sometimes people just want to be asked.
They want to be asked, right? And it's power to the people, so let's hear from the people.
And we want to hear from you. Closer look at villagemedia.ca. That is our email address. And while you're online, make sure you sign up to get copies or new episodes sent to your inbox every night at closerlookpodcast.ca. Derek Turner, producer of this evening's program, as always, for Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for your time tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock right here on Closer Look.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.